From Gutenberg's press to the Internet of Things. While the beginning of communication media is off-peg to the 1400s with Johann Gutenberg's printing press, some classifications go further back, as we have done so in previous episodes, back to ancient times in the Mideast and Far East with the art and practice of ancient art, writing, code, and symbol creation. This timeline refers to this as the prehistoric age, meaning before the popular recording and writing of history as we know it today. Realize these are but human-created classifications of time and events that can be up for debate, as one can argue given a writing system had been developed here and we do have such records on clay tablets and stones, this isn't then, strictly speaking, prehistory.
During the Middle Ages, books were written out by hand, mostly in monasteries. Often the monks would spend years on a work. In the German city of Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg invented the technique of printing with movable type. This made it possible to duplicate books in large numbers and at relatively low cost. The technological foundation was laid for the intellectual, political and religious changes of the succeeding centuries. He started on a mammoth venture, the Latin Bible. For this project, he cast more than 100,000 pieces of type. For more than 2 years, Gutenberg's typesetters and printers worked on the first edition of 180 copies. The text was printed in black letter or Gothic type, based on the handwriting of the day. Finally, the illuminator added the coloured initials and drawings. With his Bible, one of the world's most beautiful printed books, Gutenberg proved that a work printed with movable type could be as aesthetically pleasing as one written by hand. The edition was soon sold out. Gutenberg's contemporaries were impressed. It was the first time a work had been available in such a large edition, and every copy was identical. The written word now had authoritative status. Gutenberg himself did not make a fortune with his invention. He'd not even finished printing his Bible before his financial backer called in the loan. In the legal battle that followed, Gutenberg lost not only his printing press, but also all the Bibles he'd already printed. Soon afterwards, Mainz was occupied by hostile troops. Gutenberg had to go into exile. 3 years later, he was allowed back as an employee of the new archbishop. On the 3rd of February 1468, Johannes Gutenberg died. He was buried in the Franciscan church in Mainz.
We zoom into the popular beginning known as the Industrial Age, ushered in by Gutenberg's print by movable type. Much has been said about how this printing press ushered in the Age of Discovery, which ushered in the Scientific Revolution, the Renaissance, and the French Enlightenment. And while it might have, there are details in this popular story which can be better framed in consonance with reality, what actually happened as both logic and our empirical records attest. Here's what a book written to honor and celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation has to say about this printing press. It was 60 years since Johann Gutenberg had announced to general applause the success of his experiments printing with movable type, but the long-term consequences of his technological development were still decidedly uncertain. Those who enthusiastically embraced the new medium found it was remarkably difficult to make money producing printed books. Most of the first printers lost money and many went bankrupt. The author goes on further. It was by no means clear how or why printing could serve a great movement of change. Printers, in fact, discovered that the most reliable profits lay in servicing the needs of traditional religion. They would need more persuading to abandon this steady, established business. It seems the free market was trumped since efforts at persuasion needed to be employed to abandon this steady, established business from traditional religion. Luther created what was essentially a new form of theological writing, lucid, accessible, and above all, short. Luther made the bold and radical decision to speak beyond an informed audience of trained theologians and address the wider German public in their own language, German. This decision to move beyond the language of scholarship, Latin, was deeply controversial, but it allowed complex theological ideas to be presented to a non-specialist audience. There seems to have been much concern for communicating complex theological ideas to a non-specialist audience. Luther and his disciples didn't have such a notable view of the common man. Luther understood the aesthetics of the book. He appreciated that the quality and design of the printed artifact that presented his message was itself a visual totem to its respectability and truth. Interesting. Quality and design, visual totem to respectability and truth. Luther should have instinctively discerned the value of brevity. Luther, in effect, invented a new form of theological writing, short, clear, and direct, speaking not only to his professional peers, but to the wider Christian people. Short, clear, and direct, because unlike himself and his professional peers, the wide audience isn't, even if previously the author admits to the established business success of printing for traditional religion. Luther replaces the 95 propositions of the Latin theses with 20 short paragraphs, each developing a single aspect of the question. None is more than 3 or 4 sentences long. The sentences are short and direct. The whole work is a mere 1,500 words. It fits perfectly into an 8-page pamphlet. This was a revolution in theological writing, for this was not an age that in general valued brevity. Short seemed to be Luther's expertise. The author makes one wonder whether the wider non-specialist audience really couldn't appreciate, given it was in fact not the age of brevity, implying the audience could and did accept and embrace, given the established success of the printing business for traditional religion. How could one conduct a debate when one party, Luther, had deliberately stepped out of the normal structures of academic discourse? How indeed can one argue or debate when discourse is non-academic, meaning not scholarly, meaning departing from rules of logic and reason? In 1520, Luther was the most prolific living author since the invention of the printing 70 years before. His works had been published more frequently than any known author in the history of Western letters. The most published authors of the first age of print were almost all historic figures, classical authors such as Cicero or Aristotle, medieval churchmen, and the early church fathers. Luther had somehow made a breakthrough in the most conservative of genres, theology. And Luther was all too inclined to dismiss opponents as ignorant blockheads. Earlier, though, the author claimed Luther's opponents and peers, unlike the wider Catholic audience, were professional. Engaging this new public would ultimately be hugely lucrative for Germany's printers. Capturing new readers required both ingenuity and innovation. A new movement required a new sort of book. Germany's printers gradually settled on a book. This was Brand Luther. Ingenuity, innovation, Brand Luther. No mention of logic or reason thus far. The first hint that the Reformation could offer something better came when Luther's works were taken up in Germany's larger printing centers. The pamphlet version of the 95 Theses, published by Adam Petrie in Basel, is a quite beautiful piece of work. Careful use is made of indentation to distinguish the separate theses. White space to guide the eye is elegant. Pamphlet, careful indentation, white space is elegant. All would be in the quarto format. They were usually very short, 8 or 16 pages, which would have been 1 or 2 sheets of paper printed and then folded into 4, hence quarto. Using so little paper, they were always very cheap. Customers took to purchasing large numbers, which they then bound together in impromptu anthologies. These Flugschriften usually had a neat, orderly title page spelling out the subject, and in Luther's case, naming the author. This was important, for it was not universally the case that the title page would include the author's name. The title page including the author's name, cult of personality versus reason arguments? The title page would also make use of decorative wood blocks to encase the text. Cranach gave the Reformation some of its most memorable images. Luther, in return, would take a strong line against the radical rejection of pictorial art promoted by some of his Gutenberg colleagues. The painter snatched a moment to sketch Luther bearded in his disguise as a German knight, the portrait of Junker Georg that has become an important milestone in creating the Luther legend. Cranach captured the staging posts of Luther's life and career. There is the harrowed-hunted figure of 1525, Cranach's most shocking and evocative psychological portrait. The serene pastor of mature years, the most copied of all his images, the grumpy patriarch of the 1540s. Oh, the drama of sketching and presenting a character versus reasoned argument. Doring was another of Luther's closest friends among the citizenry and one of Wittenberg's wealthiest merchants. It was Doring who had loaned the horses and carriage that had carried Luther and his companions to Worms. He also had a large trucking business, so could handle the distribution of the consortium's books to other places of sale. Cranach also invested in the purchase of a paper mill. This way, he would control the whole of the production process. It was a typically bold and decisive intervention in an industry that, thanks to Luther, seemed to promise healthy profit. Wealthy friends, distribution, healthy profit. Ironic, given Luther had been attacking the Catholic Church for turning a profit for their own publications, which didn't require the kind of orchestrated and managed promotion as Luther's did. The publishing arm of the business was something that Cranach pursued only for a few years. Cranach possessed one asset that made him quite indispensable to all of Wittenberg's printers: a monopoly on the production of illustrative and decorative woodcuts. So much concern for design, indeed, an expert with a monopoly was commissioned. Until this point, grand woodcut title page designs would have been confined to the largest, most expensive books. Cranach's exquisite work now adorned pamphlets that might sell for more than a few pence. Martin Luther, the name is often in a bold type of larger size in a manner calculated to spring off the page, catching the eye of purchasers. Catchy was invented. This intense focus on the person of Martin Luther was encouraged in the public mind by the wide circulation of woodcut images of the Reformer, always in the first years presented as a solitary figure in monk's cowl. Of course, as Luther was well aware, this perception vastly oversimplified the motive power of his movement. Indeed, had Luther been such a solitary figure, his Reformation would quickly have died. Certainly, the movement could not have been sustained. Luther would not have survived to face his critics at the Diet without the steady support of influential friends. Supporters included ecclesiastical superiors, friends on the city council. Luther, as politically literate as he was theologically inspired, was well aware of the need for friends. Indeed, friends and politics mix with Luther. By the end of the 1520s, many German cities, including powerful regional centers such as Hamburg, Strasbourg, and Nuremberg, had taken the essential measures to institute a state-led Reformation. The Reformation depended on powerful local figures. Luther's movement relied very heavily on the gifts of those who pledged their eloquence and authority to his cause. Gift. Luther also understood his own importance to the Reformation's extraordinary success. However he might muse in his letters and sermons on his role as the humble instrument of God's purpose, he was fully aware that his own personality and the drama of his struggle with the church authorities was what had piqued public interest and furnished the movement with its most powerful shield against those who would destroy it. There is a fascinating little vignette in an otherwise routine letter to Spalatin in early March 1521, while Luther was awaiting his summons to Diet of Worms. With this letter, he enclosed some copies of Cranach's early engraved portrait of himself, which at Cranach's request he had also autographed. The signed portrait as gift is something we associate with modern celebrity culture, to be displayed by the honored recipient as a token of acquaintance with leading statesmen, actors, or musical artists. It is curious to find Luther already engaged in something similar. It seems Luther invented the cult of celebrity. This is not the only way in which Luther exploited his fame to build the movement. In the published works of the Reformation, Luther also lent his prestige to works written by others by furnishing a brief preface or recommendation. These celebrity endorsements offered a seal of approval for a writing campaign. Celebrity endorsement, too, is Luther's legacy. Many of Luther's advocates left no record at all of how they arrived at their beliefs. For many, the decision to preach Luther's gospel was solitary and intensely personal. These, in many ways, were the boldest of the Reformation's pioneers, acting without the support of an extended circle of fellow enthusiasts, moved solely by their sense of the rightness of the new evangelical doctrines. Indeed, Luther's followers were governed not by reason but by intensely personal concerns, moved solely by their sense of rightness of the new evangelical doctrines. This contradicts the Protestant claim of being true to the Bible. How can one be true when driven solely by a personal sense of rightness in reading doctrine? What animated this resistance? A major role can be attributed to the tumultuous maelstrom of pamphlets cascading from the German presses. For it was in precisely these years, 1520 to 1525, that the print onslaught reached its peak, a torrent of urgent, biting satire, excoriating denunciations of traditional authority and pious reflections on the Christian life. Indeed, Luther's promotions network, funded by his government friends, was sprinting away. The next 10 years would witness a sequence of princely states and territories adhering to the movement and proclaiming a new evangelical church order on the Saxon model. In the longer term, the reformed evangelical clergy would become in effect servants of the state, drawing their salaries from state funds and cooperating with state-appointed supervisors and visitors in the management of the church and the lives of their congregations. Indeed, the Protestant claim of Catholic control and intervention, and thus calling for the separation of church and state, is myth. Luther worked to subsume church under the state. The protestation of Speyer was the prelude to the creation of a formal association of territories adhering to the Reformation, and incidentally the origin of the name Protestant. Much of Luther's energy in these years was expended as an advisor to princes, a strategist in the high-stakes game of ecclesiastical politics. Advisor to princes, ecclesiastical politics, still nothing on logic and reason in the evaluation of ideas and arguments. By 1529, Luther had also refined his understanding of how Christian education should be accomplished. He no longer believed that this crucial task could be left in the hands of parents or even pastors. If parents did not value education, then their children would not be sent to school. Parents, particularly those engaged in agriculture, would not sacrifice their children from necessary tasks in the home or fields for the doubtful benefits of learning their ABCs. The only solution was to place responsibility for ensuring attendance in the hands of the local government. The state, as Luther bluntly told Duke John in 1526, must be the guardian general of the young, taking on the obligations of negligent parents. In Melanchthon's more melodious phrase, government should serve as a common father. The duty of compulsory school provision was later routinely encapsulated in the church orders and ecclesiastical constitutions provided for Lutheran cities and territories. We have Luther to thank for daily mandatory education, which took children away from their parents and home to be raised by the state, just like Sparta, in these government-regulated schools. One might ask, what was Luther's ulterior motive for this? It enabled his Protestant ideas a chance, because these were mandated in the school curriculum. Contrary to popular belief, Luther's ideas were quite unpopular. As the book's author himself admits, it wasn't the age of brevity, and traditional religion had been quite popular. It would take some persuasion for Luther's rebellious creed to begin to penetrate. Luther's goal of universal provision, if not universal attendance, was now close to being realized. All of these new schools would be placed under the control of the local authorities. Luther articulated the classic printing industry argument for market regulation, that the prior investment of the first printer on editorial work, translation costs, new types, or woodcuts should be protected against competition. A fan of welfare, subsidies, and protections, it seems Luther's printing press received help. Luther laid out for the first time his doctrine of the two kingdoms, spiritual kingdom in which man exists purely in relationship with God, and the temporal kingdom in which man's fleshly needs and sinful nature have necessarily to be restrained by the exercise of civil authority. Luther, in his society, sensed that society required firm and sometimes cruel regulation, and that the current order of government in Germany was ordained by God for this purpose. Any sort of resistance to properly ordained government was something to which he was viscerally opposed. Luther was quite the fan of state control, especially when the one in power was his, or a good friend of his. Special prayers were printed to be distributed to all the churches. Children were to learn them by heart. In return for this dutiful service, the children were presented with a specially minted medal. Ulm printed 4,000 copies of the Jubilee Prayer and distributed 2,250 medals. Many territories had such medals struck, most bearing images of Martin Luther and references to the Reformation drama or its key theological precepts. This medal culture was the innovative cornerstone of a veritable media blitz, produced a notable outpouring of commemorative broadsheets intended to be exhibited on the walls of public places or in private homes. Luther's media blitz doesn't disappoint. After Luther, print and public communication would never be the same again. Indeed, we've never been the same. Luther's dream is our present. Luther gave to Caesar what wasn't and will never be Caesar's. Fast forward to today. How much have we given to Caesar? How much of life today is from Luther? But we've just scratched the surface here. Who exactly was this Martin Luther, founder of the supposed Protestant Reformation, champion of freedom and the common man from the tyrannical and overbearing Catholic Church hierarchy?
The Protestant community has remained unaware of the underlying causes of the Reformation, and secondly, the true face of Martin Luther has similarly been obscured and hidden from view. I keep telling my students, if I repaint a university red and have a swimming pool installed and let's say set up a bar, then this is a reform. However, if I raise the university to the ground and build a circus or something similar instead, then this can no longer be called a reform.
I never refer to the Protestant Reformation as a reforming, as a reformation. It was a revolution, and it was a revolt against the prevailing theological order. And with that theological order came a whole cultural and political order that flowed from it.
When I'm asked by my children what the Reformation was, I explain to them that the king simply decided to rob the church. The king appropriated what once belonged to the church. He dethroned the Pope and put himself in his place. Now I am the head of the church, ordered the king. All church property is now mine, and I will make all future decisions.
Everybody's going to create Luther as they want to create Luther. So if you want to make Luther into the founder of modern freedom, or the founder of the modern democracy, or the founder of feminism, or the founder of whatever, go ahead and make him into that, because people do not have the habit of actually testing what it is that they're saying with the real historical Luther.
We do not realize the significance of overthrowing St. Peter, just as if we were to destroy the basilica now, which in any case can't be completely ruled out given to the times we live in. So if they were to demolish the basilica and erect a new one, we would all be deeply shocked. But that has already happened. And the decision had been made by the humanist Renaissance popes. Luckily, a marvelous colonnade and an equally magnificent dome were constructed. But today's basilica is 400 years old, whereas its predecessor was 1,200 years old. But the previous St. Peter's Basilica was stupendous. Stupendous. It was Constantine who began its construction. It was here that all the relics of the martyrs were found. It was there that the coronation of Charlemagne took place 1,200 years ago. All of that was razed to the ground and destroyed. Such a radical decision was taken during the late 15th and early 16th century and was closely related to the spirit of humanism and the Renaissance. It was tantamount to breaking away from the medieval world. Back then, it was not yet a theological divide. Theologically, things were correct. It was a mental divide, foreshadowing what was going to happen to the Church. What we have at the beginning of the 16th century AD is the civilization known as Christendom, the Corpus Christianum. As rightly pointed out by a number of researchers, the civilization in question was a byproduct of the evangelization undertaken by Papal Rome. The beginning of the great geographical discoveries, the invention of the printing press, and the onset of the Renaissance humanism constitute the marvels related above all to the Catholic Church and Catholic monarchs. Europe then experiences an economic prosperity, which is evidenced by a rise in wealth. Earlier still, we can discern such signs of budding capitalism as banking in the Italian city-states in the 13th and 14th centuries. Catholics built cathedrals, universities, as well as ironworks. New industrial centers appear, among others in the Holy Roman Empire, divided at the time into a number of kingdoms, principalities, and sovereign units such as archdioceses, abbeys, and free imperial cities.
Also, basic facts and all the Jubilee narratives are no more than fabrications for political expediency. Whose political orders might those have been? Surely those of the Prussian King Frederick and his successors, of Bismarck, Hitler, or Honecker, the brutal regimes which happened to choose Luther as their patron saint and founding father. And rightfully so? Let's find out.
Luther's approach and thinking came to be marked by a certain brutality that we are going to talk about. It was not theology that Luther studied, but civil secular law. Luther dueled with his friends, even though dueling was something strictly forbidden. If it had come to the notice of the administration of justice that two masters of arts had been dueling, they would both have been condemned to death, in line with the region's laws at the time. And what happens next? Martin Luther is wounded, and he is then looked after by the woman with whom he has illegitimate children. Here we come face to face with a factor which clearly cannot be left out, because Martin Luther was known virtually till the end of his life in 1546 as a short-tempered person and a womanizer, which he himself never tried to conceal. What's more, he boasted about it. Thus, one does not reiterate any propaganda created for the sake of religious argument or any black legend aimed at Martin Luther. With his wounds healed, Luther returns to university, and another duel takes place.
Soon after his MA exam, Luther wounds a university friend in a duel. The wound is fatal.
By making use of his knowledge of law, Martin Luther escapes the death penalty. Where to? To a monastery.
Luther took a chance on his monastic right of asylum. The administration of justice was obliged to respect the monastic right of asylum. And his university friends wrote to him, "What on earth are you doing in a monastery? What shall we do with your cohabitant and your bastards?" The word they used refers to illegitimate children. What are we supposed to do with them now that you are in a monastery?
But Martin Luther, you have no vocation. You are a lawyer. And Martin Luther wrote back, "Friends, were I to leave this dark monastic cloak, they would cut my head off."
Luther replied, "I have to stick to this damned monastic cloak. Otherwise, they will cut off my head."
Certainly, in the official version, this turning point was dreamt up. Most authors carry on reproducing a legend about a thunderstorm, during which Luther allegedly vowed to join a monastery. The primary sources were critically examined only by Dietrich M., whose works, however, remain ignored. In order to get a better understanding of the situation in which our anti-hero found himself, it's worth realizing the cultural role played by the massive religious organization which he just joined.
Definitely, it was the church that gave us civilization. It was the Catholic Church that brought the light of Christianity to Norway, which had been engulfed in pagan darkness before St. Olav's arrival. It was the church that gave us the first code of Christian laws. It was thanks to the church that forced marriages came to an end. It was also thanks to the church that it was no longer acceptable to put infants to death. The same infants which previously were abandoned in forests and left to their own devices. It was no longer permitted to kill the elderly, who used to be hurled into the abyss. Women were now able to reject unwanted suitors. And monasteries, as well as nunneries, cropped up all over Norway, spreading knowledge about the faith. It was monasteries that led to the development of agriculture. It was they who introduced all sorts of improvements and continued scientific and experimental development. Norway owes all this to the Catholic Church.
In those days, one can talk about Europe with one emperor, one authority, and one faith, the Catholic faith. One language, Latin. It was a Christian civilization, society characterized by a great diversity on the one hand and by a profound unity on the other. There were different states, customs, habits, traditions, but there was one faith and one vision of the world. As a result of the crisis, or rather of the Protestant Revolution, this civilization breaks apart. As he had received the sacrament of the Holy Orders, he was now a Catholic priest. Though this was no consolation to him, he would say to himself how difficult it was going through his first Holy Mass. For him, the words repeated by a Catholic priest during the transubstantiation were hard to accept.
Now, the next stage is this very vague but clearly important experience that he talks about, his so-called tower experience.
When Luther is in the latrine in the monastery tower, he experiences what he himself calls an illumination. This comes about while he is reflecting on a certain Holy Bible verse from the book of Habakkuk, which says that it is a good thing to live for the sake of faith alone.
And this experience in the tower, focused or working with his examination of Scripture, leads him to believe that he has discovered the key to Scripture. His idea is that man, after original sin, is totally depraved. And since man is incapable of pleasing God, that means that he can be redeemed and be a sinner at the same time.
So he poured through the Old Testament and the New Testament looking for something, and he stumbled across that famous line in Romans that we were justified by faith. And for him, that was the ta-da, the eureka moment.
Luther went off to teach at the University of Wittenberg. He became converted to the humanist approach. A return to the rhetorical, a move away from the logical, a move away from the philosophical. But the humanists disliked all of that, and they were steeped in a literary mode of expressing themselves rather than a logical one.
Luther was a restless spirit who found compensation for his phobias in ferocious and disorderly work, in the exegeses of the Holy Scriptures, in theological studies, and chaotic deliberations. This work, however, made him neglect his own spiritual life to such an extent that he ran out of time for the necessary prayer. Here, in his own testimony concerning the years preceding the events of 1517, namely the question of indulgences, as he put it himself in those days, he no longer said his breviary, although this was obligatory for all priests and monks. Luther begins to focus on the Bible, which then enables him to influence people and gain popularity with them. He would say he no longer prayed, nor have enough time to celebrate the Holy Mass because he had to study. He had to preach. He also supervised other monasteries. In short, Luther fell victim to feverish activism.
15th century, we have to deal with the Renaissance papacy. The pontiffs from Italy's most powerful families are elected. The House of Medici, a famous Italian banking family, produces a few popes who wanted to tear down the old St. Peter's Basilica and erect the one which we know today. Therefore, these popes were in need of enormous sums of money.
The papacy became an instrument used by the powerful of this world, who were obsessed with the buying and accumulating of church offices. The church was undergoing another crisis in its history.
What has become of the ministry? Where is the evangelization?
The church's external appearance as far as the sacraments are concerned remained the same. Having said that, many people had a mental attitude characterized by secularization and inner emptiness. Once upon a time, indulgence was announced in the region of Saxony, central Germany. Naturally, this was considered from the start as a cynical way of handling the means of salvation.
A certain wealthy noble, Albrecht Hohenzollern of Brandenburg, was 24 years old and had already been in charge of 2 dioceses, and he wanted another diocese. The third diocese was one of the 7 offices which influenced the election of the emperor. In order to be able to pay the Pope for his nomination for the Archbishop of Mainz, Albrecht incurs a debt. He borrows the necessary money from the banking house run by the Fugger family. To get out of this debt, the said Albrecht of Brandenburg becomes involved in collecting money contributions coming from the indulgences earmarked for funding the building of the new St. Peter's Basilica.
The potential abuse is obvious. Money brought the remission of penalties meted out in purgatory. Unfortunately, some tactless preachers, perhaps not necessarily actuated by bad intentions, took advantage of the situation by setting up a genuine indulgence trading business. There was a Dominican friar called Tetzel who made explicit financial offers. In return for donating money for the building of St. Peter's Church here in Rome, one would automatically be forgiven one's sins. And this was the primary reason for Martin Luther's rebellion, the nailing of these 95 theses to a door of a Wittenberg church. It is said today that this in fact did not take place at all, but what is beyond a doubt is that it was in 1517 that Martin Luther came out. In any case, in his 95 theses, he harshly criticized the superficial nature of the system of granting indulgences and of the church authority.
Luther as an Augustinian and Tetzel as a Dominican represent two different corporations, while Frederick III, Elector of Saxony and Luther's supporter, has every reason not to tolerate any competition on his territory. The competition, which excludes him from any share in the giant operation of transferring the German cash by the bank house of the Fuggers of Augsburg to the bank account of the Hohenzollers of Brandenburg and Rome. The better we get to know Luther, the harder it will be to believe in any action on his part without a political cover-up.
All books mention that Luther rebels against the scandalous practice of indulgence trading, which was a source of revenue for the church. This is just an excuse. Had it been a true problem, it would have sufficed not to donate any money, and it would have all been over. So it was just a pretext considering what must be mentioned at this point. The rebellion against Rome had been growing for a long time in this Germanic world. What is often forgotten is the political economy. Had Luther not enjoyed Frederick the Wise's Elector of Saxony's support, the game with Rome would have been lost. The prince owned a vast collection of relics stored in Wittenberg, as well as the privilege of indulgence trading, enabling a person to reduce their stay in purgatory by up to hundreds of years.
And Luther had been there. He had been at Frederick's place, and he knew about the collection very well. He was perfectly conscious of the inventory of relics, thanks to which pilgrims could gain indulgences, naturally for money, by visiting Frederick's residence. So the question of indulgences is but a pretext for the entire revolution unleashed by Luther.
One element which accounts for the success of the revolt is the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg. Luther is one of the first people to take advantage of print as an instrument of propaganda. The theses were widely disseminated by means of the new printing technology. Intense and heated debate over these theses began. It is then that we can observe some signs of agitation, first among the academics and then also among the common people. In Rome, they did not realize immediately what had happened. Cardinal Cajetan gave Luther as many as 3 chances, and the talks went on for 3 days. Ultimately, Cajetan gave up his struggle in the face of Luther's obstinacy. Leo X delayed condemning Luther for too long. He hesitated, he wavered. Finally, thanks to repeated pressure from theologians, especially Cajetan, the text of the 1520 papal bull appeared, Ex Surge Domine, which lists Luther's errors and condemns him as a heretic. Even before being excommunicated by Rome, Luther publishes a text called Adversus Execrabilim Antichristi Bullum, defining the Pope as an Antichrist. He says there, "Before you excommunicate me, I will excommunicate you."
If, during the ongoing propaganda campaign, the consecutive cities visited by Luther, Augsburg, Leipzig, Worms, were practically inundated with leaflets by his followers, then who were those supporters? Luther's charisma alone is definitely not enough. Even today, an operation like this would require substantial financial investments and logistics. Who was capable of providing all of this at the time?
City councils accept and introduce the Reformation among their townspeople. Lutheran revolt could not have taken place without the aid of German princes, starting with the Elector Frederick of Saxony, who protected him. If he had not received any support, everything would have come to an end, just like any other heresy in the past centuries. And it is politics that begin to play an important part, politics and economy. There is interdependence between politics, economy, and the interests of the princes. So Luther is playing with fire.
Johannes Reuchlin.
Von Sachsen steht Johannes Reuchlin.
He's a great humanist. Reuchlin was very much influenced by the Jewish Kabbalah, including the world of magic. Magic was taken seriously by a number of humanists. And in being influenced by this, Reuchlin studied Hebrew to understand the Kabbalah. He became the focus of a battle back in the decade before Luther appears as a public figure on the scene, which is referred to as the Reuchlinstreit, the famous Reuchlin battle, a kind of humanist controversy against allowing the Kabbalah and the Talmudic books to circulate. But Reuchlin argued firmly for their being allowed to be free. And his voice was heard above the others. It was the immediate prelude to Luther, which is hugely important and almost nobody ever talks about. By the way, I should add that his nephew became Luther's chief follower, Melanchthon. But the reason why it's a preparation for Luther is because, in this case, printers and publishers were realizing with the Reuchlin battle that this was a moneymaker. And you do have a kind of experience that's gained from the Reuchlin battle that is able then to serve you in the indulgence controversy that comes afterwards, because you do know how to promote and attack and what works and what does not work.
A number of researchers view the case of Reuchlin or the Jewish book controversy as crucial to Luther's success. In his works, Heinrich Graetz said that it was the Talmud that awakened the sleeping giant in the Germans, even though they themselves do not confirm it. Moreover, Louis Israel Newman expressly maintained that the Jewish issue helped to spread the flame of the Reformation. There are numerous quotations which testify to great hopes aroused by Luther among the Jewish diaspora, and vice versa. Luther publishes a text about Jesus Christ who was born a Jew. Accomplished Hebraists are consulted during the collective work of Luther and Melanchthon's team on the translation of the Bible. With time, disappointment will follow owing to Luther's later anti-Jewish texts. This, however, will not discourage the Jews from supporting the spread of Protestantism.
That's why Protestantism begins with and ends with just the Bible. The problem, however, with just the Bible, sola scriptura, is who interprets it. The church gave birth to the Bible, not the other way around. It wasn't until the beginning of the 5th century that we really had an agreed upon, this is the canon of Scripture. These are the 73 books of Scripture.
It was the church that established the so-called biblical canon, that is, the books which are regarded as genuine and authoritative, consequently denouncing the church as a realm of an alleged papist antichrist while emphasizing the significance of the Holy Scriptures as the only authority for believers was self-contradictory.
Martin Luther didn't care about that. He didn't care so much that he took, of the 73, he threw out 6 and bits and pieces of other ones. So Martin Luther shrunk the Bible by about 10% as far as the numbers of books are concerned.
And he called them epistles of straw. Well, for example, the Epistle of James the Apostle was flawed in Dr. Martin Luther's eyes because it contained passages which openly contradicted his teachings, because the Apostle said that faith without deeds is dead. Besides, Luther deliberately manipulated his translation in some places. For example, when it came to St. Paul's epistle to the Romans.
He actually inserted a word in Romans on that line, we are justified by faith. He inserted alone. We are justified by faith alone. Now, many of his followers, his disciples, people in league with him, told him that's probably going a little far. So Protestant Bibles today don't have the word alone in it, but originally his German Bible did. And that's very reflective of his mentality.
Also, in one of his letters, Martin Luther reassures his followers by saying, if any papist try to point out this inaccuracy to you in a theological dispute, tell him that the translation was done by Dr. Martin Luther.
You tell him that Dr. Luther would have it not that way, and what Dr. Luther says is good enough. So the interesting point here in history, when it sort of played itself out, is for a man who wanted to get rid of a pope, he really set himself up as the pope.
Luther had set a bad example, and many other priests followed in his footsteps. Nuns denounced their vows, got married.
But in order to be able to pursue his particular project, he needs physical force behind him. He comes up with this famous phrase that the princely and the city authorities become necessary bishops. There's no room for a church, and hence that means the authority of the state.
Part of German aristocracy was greatly interested in the Reformation because of the huge wealth accumulated by the monastic communities as a result of their considerable efforts, and we know that Martin Luther called for the desertion of the monasteries.
And all that wealth owned by those whose existence Luther refuses to accept, who is going to take it over? The princes who convert to Luther's Reformation.
Monasteries were being devastated and looted, with monastic families being dispersed. The most brutal methods were used against those who refused to leave.
If you understand the gospel properly, then believe me, this cannot be solved without disturbances, without public outrage, and without rebellion, writes Luther to Spalatin, Prince Frederick's secretary. After all, you won't make a quill out of a sword and peace out of war. Somewhere else, he explains, it's better to murder all bishops, uproot all monasteries and orders, than to allow even one soul to perish. Because if they won't listen to God's word and abandon themselves to folly and rabies, what thing other than a violent revolt that will wholly uproot them can happen to them? And we, Luther says, will be splitting our sides with laughter while it is going on.
On behalf of the German Evangelical Church, they demand part of the Catholic Church's wealth for themselves. The war is in progress. The said nobles and knights are quickly defeated, but soon afterwards, a popular revolt breaks out.
In the years 1524 to 1525, Germany is racked by the Great Peasants' Revolt led by Thomas Müntzer. When the peasants rose, they did so because they had inferred a superfluous nature of any authority from Luther's principle of free interpretation of the Bible. Thus, they rose against the secular and ecclesiastic authority. Then Luther paradoxically called for military intervention. He insisted that the peasants who were captured should be hanged, tortured on a breaking wheel, dismembered, and submitted to other cruel punishments.
Well then, firstly, he lets the princes take over all the church's wealth in the name of God. But he doesn't want the peasants to do the same. Luther produces a horrifying text against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants. He says, "Let whoever can stab, strangle, and kill them publicly or secretly, in the conviction that there is nothing more poisonous, pernicious, and diabolical than a rebel, just as if you were to kill a mad dog."
Luther writes to the German aristocrats, "Crush these wild scoundrels until the last one is slain."
The Revolutionary Army lose their last battle at Frankenhausen. The rebel communist priest, Thomas Müntzer, is beheaded. Luther denies knowing Müntzer early enough not to end up like him. A similar fate will await many other extremists who fail to conform to the current situation, which finds its proper expression in Luther. Müntzer, who accidentally did carry a rainbow banner, is commemorated by the allegorical panorama created in the course of 10 years by a renowned East German painter, Werner Tübke. However, in the 16th century, it is the Bolsheviks that have to give way to the Mensheviks. What triumphs is the compromise with the authorities.
So 10 years after the massacre of German peasants, Luther says, "I killed all the peasants during the rebellion, and their blood is upon my head. But I put it all on our Lord God. He commanded me to speak like that. And here we arrive at the principal contradiction inherent in the Lutheran concept of man.
In Luther's opinion, one of his most important works is De Servo Arbitrio, on the bondage of will, which is a reply to Erasmus of Rotterdam's treatise on free will. Luther puts forward the following thesis there. Man is not free in his relation to God.
And Luther writes to Erasmus of Rotterdam, "It was only you, Erasmus, that understood me properly. What I am preoccupied with is not indulgence trading, purgatory, or the papacy. What concerns me is the bondage of the will, which is my primary consideration. It is not a poor man that is guilty, but an unjust God. It was God who made Adam fall. It was God who made Judas betray him. God as the creator of both good and evil. He even extended his evil to Christ and put him to death for the first time in heaven and for the second time on Mount Golgotha before our very eyes."
So this God is, according to Luther, a tyrant. And Jesus of Nazareth is described as simul justus et peccator, at once just and sinner. Nowhere in the Holy Scriptures is Jesus of Nazareth called a sinner. But Luther's faith has nothing to do with the Catholic faith, as the latter is based on reason, and Luther repudiates reason as the devil's whore.
Luther is the total enemy of rationality because he cannot deal with this idea of capturing God by means of reason, by means of logic.
And Luther says, in this most important work of his, on the bondage of the will, that God predestines one man for hell, irrespective of the good he does, and another for heaven, irrespective of the evil he does. This is the theory of absolute predestination, which will be later developed by Calvin. It's a kind of giving up on God's mercy. God arbitrarily decides on a person's salvation or damnation regardless of their individual virtues.
God is evil. This moment is decisive. And for Luther, God has to be evil, so that Luther himself could be liberated from his own evil. It is not me that is evil. I myself have no freedom. It is God that predetermined my evil. God gave me this evil nature.
In doing so, Martin Luther satanizes God. In his commentary on the Book of Psalms, the following formula appears. Summa, Gott kann nicht Gott sein. Muss Suva der Teufel werden. Summa, God cannot be God until he becomes Satan first.
Monk turned Protestant transforms Prussia into a secularized state, or, in other words, simply grants himself property rights. This happens on Luther's advice, with whom Duke Albrecht makes friends, regretfully, with the Polish king's approval. This is the moment of historical tragedy. The Prussian homage, an open questioning of the fundamental principle of Christendom, that is, the separation of spiritual authority and secular power. Luther deals another blow to the old order by getting married, in line with the new fashion.
Over 20 people died at Martin Luther and Katharina von Bora's wedding feast. This shows the moral condition of the community gathered around Martin Luther. In his text on matrimonial matters, Luther demands that the emperor should redefine marriage as a marital contract. He rejects the sacrament of matrimony.
Marriage is, as Luther puts it, an earthly thing which the Church has nothing to do with.
We can get married, conclude marital contracts, and cancel them. Thus, Luther introduces the institution of divorce, and in his text of 1530, he flagrantly calls for a death penalty for a woman guilty of adultery. And he asks himself a similar question with regard to a man. If a husband betrayed his wife, should he be sentenced to death as well? Oh no, sure, there should be a penalty for adultery for a husband, but a light one.
And now he says, indeed, if Katharina von Bora, as my abducted nun and wife, refuses to comply sexually with my will, she must be replaced by a maid. I can't free myself from lechery. After all, I received this very nature from God. And as a result, I can't live without being able to satisfy my sexual drive. So let there come a maid when a wife does not want to.
Man does not have to try to be better and more perfect. He doesn't have to make any efforts to live in accordance with Christian morality. All he has to do is believe, and he will be saved.
He himself admits that he embraced at least 3 women at a time, and that he filled his life with piggishness and drinking, to which he had every right. He says he had to drink about 7 liters of sweet wine a day, so that his good mood did not leave him. Luther calls the Pope the Antichrist, and says that the papacy is the realization of Satan's will.
These are insults and vulgarisms. He had obscene drawings done, drawings which Protestants themselves keep out of sight as they are ashamed of them.
He prepares these drawings in cooperation with Lucas Granach, one of Germany's greatest painters. It's hard to say which ones are more indecent than others. Payable to the Pope, the arch-satanic Pope, and to his cardinals. The leaflets can naturally spread much more easily than any other thing. This one is signed by Luther. D stands for doctor. And here again we have the Pope. The Pope held by Medusa, by Satan. He is being rocked, always with a tiara on his head. Multiple anal birth. This is how all the cardinal hats and papal tiaras are born. This tiara is topped with an unnatural ringlet, which is a poo. This is exactly what Luther wants to teach the Germans about Rome. Rome has always despised us, has always exploited us. You must liberate yourselves from Rome.
One of the myths concerning the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation is the conviction that it was a grassroots and spontaneous movement. However, once we analyze the historical context of the German, French, Scandinavian, and English Reformations, there is no escaping the fact that it was a top-down process. It was above all the reformation of the princes, of the rulers, and of the nobility, as well as a substantial part of the clergy, including bishops.
Henry VIII got rid of the Catholic Church, made up his own church, and then said, now divorce me from my wife so I can marry my mistress. And that's what it was. And oh, by the way, I'll chop her head off later. And all you Catholic bishops who disagreed, either you get in line or I'll chop your head off. And he chopped the head off of one of them. So the Anglican Communion was founded on murder and divorce and adultery.
Frankly speaking, everything that comes about in England is caused by one man's debauchery, which is outrageous. One can say that the church that comes into existence as a result is the most disgraceful church in the world.
Henry VIII used it as an opportunity to seize thousands of properties from the church. Monasteries, farms, churches, cathedrals. He pillaged the church, ransacked the church of all of its property.
King Gustav Vasa of Sweden acted along similar lines by declaring himself head of the Church of Sweden. The church was disintegrated, and its considerable temporalities were taken over by the royal authority. Beforehand, we were both under the church's and the bishop's rule. Now, Scandinavia became a collection of societies solely subordinate to the power of the kings and their officials.
There was some commotion in Bergen among the elite families. But generally speaking, Norway did not undergo any social revolution interested in the Reformation. The Norwegians found themselves under the pressure of the Danish king, who spent a great deal of money on military enlistment and needed considerable funds to pay his soldiers and mercenaries. And he found converting to Lutheranism very convenient, as he was able to seize the church lands and wealth. And these were vast lands, which from then on belonged to the king's realm.
And in this way, this original accumulation of capital occurred due to the theft of the church wealth, the wealth which in its major part had been spent on the needs of the poorest. The whole network of hospices, the then hospitals, shelters, all that we now call charity organizations had previously been primarily taken care of by monasteries and financed with their revenues. It was no coincidence that one of the characteristic signs of the new times was a huge number of beggars on the roads and in the cities of the English kingdom. The phenomenon had never been known before, and the beggars were basically the orphans from the shelters they had lost in the aftermath of the confiscation of the church's properties. Considerable changes took place in the Catholic domain. The images of saints were thrown away. Calvin-inspired Reformation forbade, in a way, the use and veneration of images. Just look at the old churches and the decapitated statues of the saints. It was a crucial point in an incredibly radical Reformation triggered by Calvin. Let's not forget what Calvin got up to in Switzerland, where he set a system of terror, a terrorist theocracy, so to speak. Many people were condemned and burnt there. The Night Council was in operation, and its duty was to judge the alleged heretics. The death penalty was administered to the Catholics and also for some Protestants. Miguel Servet, a Spanish Protestant, unlucky enough to end up in Geneva, was practically burnt alive. This is a true Inquisition, utterly ruthless in comparison with its Spanish counterpart.
Now a new generation of historians is looking at the Inquisition afresh. Every one of the cases that came before the Spanish Inquisition during its 350-year history had its own file. These files, gathered together from sources such as this library in Salamanca, are being properly studied for the first time.
I think our views of the Inquisition had been changed largely by the opening up of the archives of the Inquisition. They had everything on tape, as it were, hidden away in their archives. And we can go there, calculate, put it all on computer, and arrive at very firm statistics about its activity. And so all of this has opened wide the debate about the Inquisition and has also demolished totally the previous image, which all of us had.
The files are detailed and exhaustive. The Inquisition kept its activities secret from the outside world, but its clerks wrote down every detail in the confidence that their records were for the eyes of the Inquisition only. The huge task of sifting this material, previously scattered throughout Spain, daunted earlier generations. Systematic analysis is only just beginning, but already a very different version of the Spanish Inquisition can be brought to light. On the morning of October the 18th, 1469, Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Aragon, and Isabella, heiress of Castile, were married. Their wedding ended centuries of rivalry between the two Spanish kingdoms, and would unite the country. Spain, for so long merely a name on the map, had become a historical fact. The itinerant royal court often convened in the city of Avila, here at the monastery of Santo Tomas, its facade triumphantly incorporating an H for the reunified Hispania. But for Ferdinand and Isabella, there could be no political unity without religious unity. Pressure was exerted on Spain's large Jewish population to convert. Many did, but traditional Christians were suspicious that these conversos were practicing their former religion in secret. Synagogues, such as this one in Toledo, came under scrutiny. In 1480, a new body was appointed to investigate. Entitled the Santo Oficio de la Inquisición, it's better known to us as the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition's task was to discover heresy, deviation from the true faith. Conversos accused of continued Jewish worship could be burnt at the stake. The Inquisition had begun, but the myth had yet to be created. For while these years between 1480 and 1510 were by far the most active in the entire history of the Inquisition, the rest of Europe did not hurry to condemn it.
Tenemos noticias muy precisas de embajadores italianos, el embajador de Venecia, el embajador de Francia, el embajador de Florencia, que escriben a los reyes católicos felicitándoles, naturalmente, porque ya, por fin, las tierras de Iberia son tierras de cristiandad.
The truth is that the Inquisition was applauded for its persecution of Spain's converted Jews. A new age of Christian unity was said to be dawning. It didn't last. In 1517, the Church was split in two by the Reformation. It was the enormous power and wealth of the Church that the Protestant reformers made their target. A power and wealth still on display every year in Spain's religious capital, Toledo. Until then, priests had been the unquestioned mediators between God and the sinful world, essential to salvation. But the reformers declared that men came to God by faith alone, sola fide. In turmoil, the Church went on the offensive. The Church's champion, defender of the faith, was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. As leader of the Habsburg dynasty, he also commanded the most powerful armies in Europe. But Charles was more than just a Habsburg. As Ferdinand's grandson, he ascended to the throne of Spain, putting that country at the forefront of the defense of the faith. At the Battle of Mühlberg in 1547, his enemies were virtually annihilated. Routed on the battlefield, the reformers attacked elsewhere. Where the Church had the sword, the reformers had the printing press. It was no coincidence that printing was invented and spread fastest in the countries most sympathetic to the Reformation, the German states, England, and the Low Countries, where this press in Antwerp still survives. With their new technology, the Protestants could fight a different kind of war.
For the first time, it was possible to wage a real propaganda campaign. This is what the enemies of the Spanish Habsburgs did, very skillfully. The Spanish monarchy was unable to counteract that. They fought in the military domain and not in the propaganda domain, and they felt that that was an unfair way of waging a war. That was not proper of gentlemen. Gentlemen fought with weapons, not with leaflets, not with ideas.
But the polemic needed a focus. It found one in the body expressly designed to uphold the Catholic faith, the Inquisition. A myth was in the making. All the different accusations came together in this document, a discovery and plain declaration of sundry subtle practices of the Holy Inquisition of Spain, printed in 1567. Within the year, it was translated into English, French, Dutch, and German. Its author, masquerading as a Protestant victim of the Inquisition, wrote under the pseudonym Montanus. By identifying with the victim, Montanus brought the supposed horrors of the Spanish Inquisition vividly alive. It is his work which introduced to the world an image of the Inquisition which has persisted ever since.
Black legend is the name given by the Spaniards to the image created by their enemies, according to which they were greedy, cruel, tyrannical, and especially intolerant in religious terms. And of course, the role played by the Inquisition, especially in intolerance, was crucial. The Inquisition was the cornerstone of this construction.
Montanus associated the Inquisition forever with the horrors of the torture chamber. In time, even these stories of repeated cruelty began to pall.
In fact, the Inquisition uses torture very infrequently. In Valencia, for example, I found that out of over 7,000 cases, only 2% experienced any torture at all, and usually for no more than 15 minutes, and less than 1% suffered repeated torture, in other words, more than once. I found no one suffering torture more than twice.
We find, comparing the Inquisition, merely within Spain with other tribunals, that the Inquisition used torture less than other tribunals. And if we compare the Inquisition with tribunals in other countries, we find that the Inquisition has a virtually clean record in respect of torture.
During the same period in the rest of Europe, hideous physical cruelty was commonplace. In England, you could be executed for damaging shrubs in public gardens. If you returned to Germany from banishment, you could have your eyes gouged out. In France, you could be disemboweled for sheep stealing. The Inquisition used none of these methods. They had a rule book, the Instrucciones, which specified what could and could not be done. Those breaking the rules were sacked. So the Inquisition did not, as alleged, roast their victims' feet, or brick them up to languish for all eternity, or smash their joints with hammers, or flail them on wheels. And it was not only the use of torture that was falsified. Stories were also fabricated about the gruesome conditions in which prisoners were kept.
Ironically, the Inquisition had probably the best jails in Spain. This sounds very much like whitewashing, but unfortunately it's true. Let me take a quotation from the inquisitors in Barcelona in the middle of the 16th century, when they were asked to report on the state of their prisons, and they said, "Our prisons are full." But then they complained to their bosses in Madrid, "We don't know where to send the leftover prisoners we have. We cannot send them to the city jails, because the city jails are overcrowded, and there they are dying at the rate of 20 a week."
I have found instances of prisoners in secular criminal courts blaspheming in order to get into the Inquisition prison, to escape the maltreatment they received in the secular prison.
So, despite the compelling Gothic fictions of Montanus, the evidence leads us to a wholly different conclusion. The inquisitors were certainly interrogators, but they were restrained interrogators, skeptical about the effectiveness of hardship and torture in bringing heresy to light. By contrast with many other tribunals in Europe, they emerge as almost enlightened.
El caso más singular, por ejemplo, es el caso de la brujería. El Tribunal del Santo Oficio fue extraordinariamente benigno con el tema de la brujería, mientras que otras justicias europeas, justicias ordinarias y justicias eclesiásticas no tuvieron ni mucho menos la misma consideración con este tipo de delito.
Remember that the inquisitors were university lawyers, and lawyers look for evidence. So when the inquisitors looked for evidence of witchcraft, they said, okay, so this woman has killed a baby. Where is this baby? How many babies have died, and so on and so forth. And as they went through looking for the evidence, they found no evidence because, of course, witchcraft was, we may presume, an imaginary offense.
The Spanish Inquisition declared witchcraft a delusion. No one could be tried, let alone burned for it. But it was the Spanish Inquisition that came to symbolize the ruthless persecution of heresy. Why? Because by the 1560s, Spain was more than just a power. It was a superpower. Its fitting symbol, the new royal palace, a 16th century pentagon built in the hills above Madrid, El Escorial. This vast structure, comprising miles of marbled corridors, was built by Charles V's son and successor, Philip II. Under Philip, Spain completed its rise within less than a century from isolation and obscurity to the domination of Europe. Philip was at the pinnacle of earthly power, but like his father Charles, he had a higher loyalty.
Before suffering the slightest damage to religion in the service of God, I would lose all my estates and 100 lives if I had them, because I do not wish, nor do I desire, to be the ruler of heretics.
Confronted by such fervor and strength, Spain's enemies changed tack. Their new target would be the king himself.
Philip II is an excellent example of the distortions and the creations, very successful creations in this case, of the Black Legend. Philip II was presented as a monster. That's an example of the cruelty of the Spanish race. Philip II really, his policies are perfectly debatable. Personally, I don't like him, but he was no more of a monster than, say, Henry VIII of England. And Henry VIII, nevertheless, was cleaned up in order to be presented as a fit champion of Protestantism.
Philip took no such trouble with the presentation of his image, believing it beneath his dignity. He paid dearly for it. In 1568, the year after Montanus was published, a chance incident played into the propagandist's hands. The king's son, Don Carlos, died suddenly. Suspicion lighted on Philip, and it was claimed that he had not acted alone.
Among the aspects of the Black Legend, which became very current in the 16th century onwards, was that the Inquisition had encouraged the King of Spain, Philip II, to kill his own son, to execute his own son, for reasons which the king knew best and which the inquisitors knew best. For this legend, of course, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever, or to be even more firm, it is totally false, totally unsubstantiated.
His son and heir, Don Carlos, was an insane, very problematic teenager who died in an accident. But Don Carlos became something like a champion of freedom, and he was the protagonist of many plays and dramas and novels in the 17th and 18th century, the most famous of which was by Schiller, later converted into a beautiful opera, by the way, by Giuseppe Verdi.
The opera is fiction from start to finish, and the most influential distortion concerns the Inquisition, which can come and go as it pleases, here in Philip's private quarters at El Escorial, a malign spectral presence feared even by the king, and manipulating affairs of state from behind his throne. The death of Don Carlos was a godsend for the mythmakers. In reality, the Inquisition was no more the power behind the throne than the inadequate prince was a heroic martyr.
Least credible parts of the myth of the Inquisition, I suppose, are those relating to its image as being a super omnipotent institution capable of controlling the thoughts and minds of people. These inquisitors had no power to control society in the way that many historians have imagined that they had. They had no power, they had no function, they didn't have the tools to do the job. And we, in falsifying the image, have given them the tools which have never existed.
Powerless in the country, overshadowed in the city, the real Inquisition is scarcely recognizable from its myth. But it is Verdi's vision which persists of an Inquisition which can command a king and force a subject people to kneel in fear before it. In 1570, 2 years after the death of Don Carlos, and with Spanish armies occupying much of Europe, the propagandists achieved their greatest coup. A document was circulated which purported to come from the Spanish Inquisition itself, but is now proved a forgery. It alleged that the Inquisition had decided to exterminate entire populations for heresy. This would prove the most damning and durable accusation of all, that the Spanish Inquisition claimed hundreds of thousands, even millions of victims, an allegation which was the opposite of the truth.
In 16th century Spain, and dealing only in terms of Protestant heresy, fewer people died for heresy in Spain than in any other Western country. The Inquisition, for example, in the whole of the 16th century, maybe executed something like about 40 or 50 people at the outside in the whole of Spain, in the whole of the 16th century, and that includes, of course, the whole of America as well. Whereas within a small group of years, which are the reigns, we get at least the execution of 400 English people at the hands of, if we may call it, the English Inquisition, namely the English authorities who are in charge of executing people of the opposing religion. And we get the same figures in other countries. We get the same figures in France, where admittedly it was a Catholic authority. They executed something in the course of 5 or 6 years, they executed something like about 300 people. And so whichever country we look at, we find that the number of people who died for heresy in Spain, or for religious persecution of any sort, here I'm including also the conversos, is minimal compared to other countries. So that really, if every country is living in a glass house, none of them could throw stones, because Spain had the cleanest reputation in terms of killing off heretics than any other Western European nation.
This conclusion is based on the statistical research currently being conducted in the Inquisition's archives. Myth can only be destroyed by fact, and the fact is that between 3,000 and 5,000 people perished at the hands of the Inquisition. During that same period, as many as 150,000 witches alone were burnt at the stake for heresy in the rest of Europe.
On the Spanish Inquisition grew, took off, and had a life on its own. And throughout the centuries, it became more and more divorced from reality. In the 18th century, for instance, when Voltaire was crying against the crimes of the Inquisition really was killing nobody. There were no burnings or anything like that in the 18th century. And in the 19th century, when the Inquisition disappeared, they hadn't killed anyone for a very long period of time.
The Inquisition was eventually wound up in this backstreet of Madrid. Yet its supposed horrors were being more vividly presented than ever. The Spanish painter Goya depicted its abuses to satirize the corrupt Spanish government of his day.
The destruction of altars and the installation of the so-called Lord's tables in their place, the destruction of liturgy and the banning of Latin, all for the people, of course. The royal court complies, but what do the people do? The so-called dark masses take up arms, for example, in the south of England, where the Western Rebellion breaks out. The insurgents demand, among other things, the return to altars, to the veneration of saints, to the Holy Mass, the return to Latin, and the return to holidays honoring God's saints. The common people take up arms, but are exterminated by the royal army. In Elizabethan England, the Mass was said in cellars. Cassocks and habits were hidden in lay people's houses, at a farmer's, a smith's, or other common people's places. If these people were discovered, they were massacred. The Church simply put forward its truth. That was the age of St. Teresa of Avila, St. John Eudes, and all of these saints. Like the Apostle of Germany, the Blessed Peter Faber, St. Francis Xavier, St. Peter Canisius, the eminent figure theologian and a missionary who takes part in the Council of Trent. And the truth of the Council of Trent is noticeable in the lives of such great reformers as St. Francis de Sales and St. Charles Borromeo. All these saints, priests, and bishops who introduced the new order into clerical seminaries with a view to restoring priestly piety. This is the best response to Luther's sarcasms concerning the impracticality of chastity and saintliness. Obviously, not each of us in St. Francis or St. Rita were all sinners. The Catholics occasionally reacted, sometimes in the wrong way. The higher the stakes, the more dramatic and tragic the clash. For 50 years, Europe goes through wars brought on by these events. These are all tragedies, great tragedies. They need to be averted, but not by lies, for heaven's sake.
Luther is not a reformer. Luther is the first and the most important revolutionary of the second millennium. The revolutions which were to come, the French Revolution and the Communist Revolution, would take the Lutheran Revolution of 1517 as an example.
And every one of the revolutions begins and ends as an attack against the Catholic Church.
All the revolutions usurped fine words, but gave these very words the opposite meaning.
Luther is looked upon as the founder of freedom, and he's a denier of human freedom. And he is the father, in many respects, of the modern world, in being a mixture of contradictions in the sense of nice-sounding words that produce a reality in which what really dominates is the most brutal will.
In German culture, already in the 19th century, we come across the use of the term Führer, a leader, with regard to Martin Luther. Martin Luther is the first Führer in German history. Great celebrations are held to mark the successive anniversaries of the Reformation. In 1817, at the Wartburg Festival, Germany's first book burning takes place. Books with references to the country's Catholic past and works referring to the synthesis of Roman law end up at the stake to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Reformation.
So where will this Germany, which suddenly comes to hate itself and its own roots, turn to? Where will it seek its identity? In pagan mythology.
No wonder then that the first Führer's writings were very popular in the second Führer's times. It was then that by the will of its voters, regrettably, predominantly of Protestant background, Germany was under National Socialist power. And it was then that the so-called Judenschriften, that is, Luther's texts against the Jews, were reprinted.
At the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis stated, "We did what Luther says and recommends in his texts." In On the Jews and Their Lies, Luther advises the princes, "What should we Christians do with this obnoxious and condemned people, the Jews?" And he gives the following answer. First, it is advisable that all their synagogues should be burned to the ground. Secondly, their private houses should be razed and destroyed. Let the young and strong Jews, men and women alike, be made to earn their living by the sweat of their brow.
Ideas are dangerous. Ideas are dangerous. If they are rooted in something other than God and truth, they're dangerous. And in that sense, they're diabolical.
Towards the end of his life, he confessed that while he was working on his critique of the Mass, the devil was his theology professor. He even went on to say that Satan himself inspired his treatise on abolishing the Holy Mass. That is what he said.
Yes, and now Luther says he is more and more tired. I am tired, he tells his drinking companions. I will have myself eaten by the worms soon. They will get a fat doctor, these worms. I'll die. We old people have to die. He was only 63, so he wasn't old. We, the old ones, have to keep dying until we look the devil in the arse. I looked the devil in the arse.
Luther dies in 1546 after a night of binge drinking.
He was buried in All Saints' Church in Wittenberg.
beigesetzt.
The church he always called All Devils Church.
Hatte immer die Kirche zu allen Teufeln genannt.
The people carrying the corpse, university professors, were no longer capable of proceeding due to the repulsive smell that had grown to be unbearable. Even though the body was kept in a sealed metal coffin.
Luther, whose Martin Luther has given us these centuries later, is a culture that rejects God or minimizes God so much that he may as well not be there. There is some other substitute for God. It can be the state, it can be a leader, it can be whatever. On a theological level, from Luther, it's me. It's you, it's anybody watching this. You're your own little God.
Protestantism is a revolution, a revolt. Once you have been through one, you desire another. That's obvious, so why should you be satisfied with Luther? No, you won't rest with Luther, so you get the Methodists and other Protestant denominations.
Protestantism is constantly mutating because it doesn't have any bedrock principles. It doesn't have bedrock moral principles. Protestantism gave the world contraception. The Anglicans in 1930, the Lambeth Conference. Protestantism gave us abortion in the United States. Majority of the U.S. justices on the Supreme Court that voted for abortion were Protestant. These are the results of the thinking of Martin Luther.
Luther keeps negating. He negates the transubstantiation. He negates the Eucharist, the Mother of God, the saints. He curses the Pope, negates the Church and free will. Actually, Luther negates our entire faith. Over the past 50 years, we have been witnessing a Protestantization of the Catholic Church. A case in point is the participation of Protestant theologians in editing the new Mass under Pope Paul VI in 1969. Protestants took an active part in shaping the new liturgy, even though they were known to regard the Mass as a mere meeting rather than a re-sacrifice of Christ. It is a question of choice, and these are the crossroads. There exists a moment of choice, and once you become Luther's admirer, you are no longer a Catholic. If the Catholic Church, instead of opposing Lutheranism, puts her arms around it in an ecumenical embrace, then what it embraces is a corpse in an advanced state of decomposition.
It took almost 500 years for the next media technology and innovation since Gutenberg's press, which we will zoom into and tackle on the next video.